Welcome to Garden-Wise Adventures. My name is Malie and today is video number 26 on my Beginning Gardener series. And I can't be more excited. We've gotten past the bad weather, I think. We just had a storm with over 8 inches of snow. I think probably we had about 10, but a lot of it melted as it fell. And we still have a little bit of snow left on the ground, but the below freezing temperatures, like the last few nights, have been in the low 20s and, mid to low 20s. From now on, the temperatures are going to be in the 50s and the 60s. I think we have one day in the 70s coming up, and none of the nights in the forecast are going to be below freezing. So now it's time for gardening season, and I just can't be more excited. But before we get into the exciting thing about planting and preparing garden beds and all of that, I need to check on my cole crops. Now there's also one thing that I need to clear up. I got a message saying that I had a misspelling on video number 24 about my cole crops, and there is a difference between what they thought was supposed to be spelled and what is spelled. What I was talking about is cole crops, C-O-L-E. Those are the brassicas, the cabbage, broccoli, although I didn't plant broccoli, cauliflower. All of those are cole crops. They're also cold crops, C-O-L-D. So it just depends on how you look at it. But anyway, we've got to check on the cole crops that I planted before this huge storm and see how they look. We're going to check on the onions that I planted, and we're going to talk a little bit about how I protect my plants when it's going to get below freezing after I've planted them, and also how to protect them from large snowstorms like we just had. So let's look at what I have on the table out here up on my deck, and let's talk about those first. Now, some of these plants were inside for the cold weather, such as the figs. I actually also took my pansies, even though they're really cold hardy. They did suffer some cold damage when it got below 20 degrees one night, so I did bring them in, and I just brought them out this morning, and they're going to stay out from now on. But the rest of these over here, barring the trees right there, let's go over on this side so you can see. These plants right here stayed outside in 20-degree weather. These are kale, and they are a little bit worse for wear, but these will recover. Kale crops are very cold hardy, and they can handle cold weather. Now, they did have snow piled on top of them, and let me show you what I covered them with. This is called a frost cloth, or a floating row cover, and it's basically meant to protect plants from cold weather. It's kind of like a blanket. It's pretty thin, but it does hold the heat from the soil in. And it does protect plants from the cold winter winds, which I think is one part of the problem when you have damage from cold weather, when you have cold tolerant crops. It's the cold winds that suck all the moisture out of them that they can't tolerate. So I covered these down against my home, weighted the blanket down and just let them stay outside. And as you can see, they didn't die. There's some onions back here. These are the leftover onions, the ones that I didn't plant, and they are a little bit worse for wear. But everything else, including the chard, survived, although this one looks a little suspicious. We'll see if that one pulls out of it. But that's one way to protect your plants against cold weather. Now, another way to protect crops is to put them in a protected area. This is the south side of my house. The storms come from the north and go south. And then the sun, of course, beats against the south side of the house and heats things up better. I also have a small little hoop house over my garden beds that also helps protect the plants. Now, I did not use this hoop house, and we'll show you what it looks like in just a minute. And I probably should have for the seedlings that I had put the floating row cover over. They probably would have fared a little bit better. But let's look at the hoop house and talk to you a little bit more about that. Now, if you live in an area where you can't grow crops over the winter, I definitely suggest you look into growing hoop houses. Now, I'll link a video up on top and below there's several videos actually, about how I built these. And there's several things that you need to know. First thing is, how many layers do you need? This hoop house right here has a single layer. And so when I plant crops in here, which I did over the winter, and they survived just fine all winter long, and we're in Utah zone 6/7. This was an exceptionally snowy winter. Well, at least in the mountains at the ski resorts have beat the all-time snowpack. So there was a lot of snow, and the temperatures did dip into the single digits. And that was enough to protect cabbages and kale and kohlrabi in this hoop house. Now, I didn't just use the plastic to cover them. I also put a floating row cover over the top, and that really helped. The straw layer right here helps keep the soil from freezing. Now, I've done hoop houses for about 4 years. This is the first year I've actually mulched the soil. In previous years, the ground would freeze inside the grow beds, but it didn't kill the crops. They survived. This year, the ground did not freeze, and I think it was the straw that made the difference. So now we're going to take a first look at some of the crops that I planted in ground. I'm a little bit worried about the ones behind me. These are a bunch of kale and some Swiss chard that I just put a floating row cover. I hadn't planned on protecting them because they are so hardy, but we had that heavy snowfall and the temperatures did get colder than I thought, so I threw some floating row cover over the top of them. Let's pull that cover back and see what they look like. I'm a little bit worried. Now, to keep the row cover from flying away, I just weighted the 4 corners with rocks that are now frozen to they were frozen to the floating row cover. And we've got a thick layer of ice over the top. Okay, first look to see if we killed our plants by doing this. Wow, that's a sheet of ice. Let me go loosen it on the other side. Now these are all kale and Swiss chard. The flattened ones right here are Swiss chard. There's some chiji right there. And they are completely flattened, but I have full faith that these are going to recover. I've left chard completely uncovered all winter, and it does grow back the next spring in most instances, but I think they've survived. So this is my garden area. This is a west-facing slope. And if you'll notice, most of the snow has melted off this slope. If you look down here, more towards the north side of the house, the snow hasn't melted yet. Another way to protect your crops is to pay attention to where you plant them. West-facing slopes where the cold air runs down to the bottom is great. Just be careful at the bottom, especially if you have something that's blocking the cold air. You'll have cold air pool at the bottom, and that might be an area where you get frost where you don't get frost everywhere else. So west-facing slopes are good. The north-facing side of a home is probably not the best. Number one, you may not get all the sun that you need, but number two, it's going to stay colder in that area. Now, before we look at the crops in my garden beds on this hill and see how they did, let's talk a little bit about snow. Now, most people would think that if your plants are covered with snow, they would take on more cold damage, but that's not true. Snow is actually an insulator. It helps insulate your crops. If you have snow cover, you can know that there's going to be a little bit extra protection for them. So let's look at the onions that were covered by a frost cloth and see how those look. Now, when I made my onion planting video, I did give you a sneak peek of what happened with the onions, and they did turn out just fine, but it's been another night in the low 20s, so let's see if that night damaged them at all. Now, this is getting direct sun on a west-facing slope, and I don't think it froze as much as the other garden bed did. So we're just going to move the rocks out of the way. They absolutely look fine. They're a little bit smashed, they're laying down, but this is because they were just planted and they did have 8 inches of snow over the top. But these will pop up in the next few days, especially since it's going to be getting warm, and be just fine. So the onions survived. Before we open the hoop houses, let me show you this little chard. This is a chard with few little green growing points on it. It's going to bolt and go to seed really soon here, but this chard has been left out all winter and has not been covered, and it did survive. Garlic is another plant that survives cold winters just fine. These were planted last fall, and they've been through the worst of the winter. They're all sprouting right now, and even if they had sprouted last fall, they would have been just fine. But now that it's going to warm up, I think their growth is going to take off. So I'm really excited about my garlic. So garlic is another really cold hardy one, and these do not need any protection whatsoever over the winter. Here's another plant that does really well. These are lettuce seedlings. This is an area where I just let a lettuce plant set seed, and these little seedlings sprouted probably about 3 weeks ago, and they've hit the low 20s, and they're still living and doing just fine, and they're going to take off here in a little while. Now these are plants that have been in this hoop house all winter. They were planted last September, and I've left the plastic open even when it's hitting the mid to low 20s. So these are very, very hardy crops, especially once they've had a chance to harden off. These will be harvested here pretty soon, but I'm going to now leave this hoop house open. Now this was a double hoop house. Like I said, I'll link the video below on how it was built and what it looked like. This is where the outside hoop house was hooked to, and it just had like a 1-inch gap over the top of it. So this worked really beautifully. So we have carrots in here that were planted in September. They did just fine. They worked really well. We've got cabbage that was planted the day before the big storm and the day before the 20-degree temperatures. And the green cabbages up front did fine. But the red cabbages, this is interesting, they did not fare so well. So maybe red cabbages are a little bit less cold hardy. The spinach looks good, however. Spinach is extremely cold hardy. It's going to be interesting to see if the red cabbages pull out of this. Let's look at the next one. Now almost this entire bed is cauliflower. Cauliflower is definitely more cold sensitive, and I probably should have waited to plant these. There's been some damage, but we'll see how well they do. It'll be interesting to see if they recover. The white cauliflower definitely took more damage than everything else. But the Celtis took no damage. Another one that's extremely cold hardy, and I don't know where this came from, but this is a perennial green onion. It's not chives, it's not garlic chives or anything like that. This is a green onion that just continuously grows like that. It has a white flower that looks like chives. It's thicker than chives, and it tastes exactly like green onions. And these die back a little bit in the winter, and then they come back this time of year and continue to spread and grow. So these are very, very hardy. And just as I thought, these did the best because they are the most cold hardy. These are all cabbages, green cabbages, and chijimisai. These usually do the best when I try to grow them over the winter. So that is it. That is how I protect my plants in Utah Zone 6/7. I think this winter was a little closer to a Zone 6 than a Zone 7. And my plants are going to do just fine. The only ones that I'm worried about a little bit is the red cabbage that I probably will have to replace. And we're going to have to replace possibly some of the cauliflower. But luckily, those are plants that I can get transplants at from the garden center. So I'll probably end up going and doing that. But I'm going to watch them really closely and see if we start seeing any new growth. And I'd love to hear how you protect your winter plants and how much you can grow if you live in a cold area. So hopefully this video has been helpful to you. If it has been helpful, I hope you like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and go have a wonderful gardening adventure.